You always are generous, and you always give us reason to be thankful. And you're a good church. You're just a bunch of good people, and we just thank you so much. Over and over again we hear it, not just from inside here, but from outside as well. And so I just thank God for all of you. And we're going to be looking at Daniel this morning, Daniel chapter 4. And the message comes from the whole chapter, but we'll be focusing on just a few verses. The title of the message is Humbling Ourselves Before God. Being humble. I suppose that all of you have had occasions where you've run across some arrogant people. And every once in a while you'll find some arrogant people that carry badges. Well, there was a DEA officer who just happened to be traveling through West Texas and checking out all the farms out there and the ranches. And he came to one old man's farm and he said, Mister, I'm from the DEA and I'm going to have to check out your ranch just to make sure that you don't have any illegal plants growing in your garden, in your fields. And so the old man said, well, okay. He said, you're welcome too. But listen, don't go in that field over there. And about then the man reached in his back pocket and he whipped out his badge and he said, listen here, you see that badge there? He said, I represent the government of the United States. And let me tell you something, mister. I can go into any field, anytime, anywhere, any place I want to. I can go anywhere on this farm, and you can't say anything about it. The farmer was very humble, and he said, and he apologized to him. He said, I'm sorry. He said, go ahead. Is it all right if I just go ahead about my chores? And the fellow said, yeah, go ahead. And so he just went about his chores, and a little while later, all of a sudden, there was a ruckus. And he heard somebody screaming and hollering and carrying on. And so he dropped all he was doing and he ran to the fence and he saw the man running from his bull. His big old bull was out there chasing him. And he got up there on the fence and he started yelling in a loud voice and he said, hey, mister, show him your badge. Nothing like a good humbling experience. In the Old Testament, there are stories of quite a few people, but of two great and mighty kings who did battle with the Lord, the God of heaven and earth. They were both kings who were at the pinnacle of their power. Of course, it was at different times in history, about 1,000 years apart or so. And each one of them had been the rulers of vast territories. They're in the edge of the Western civilization. And each one of them thought that they were virtually gods themselves. They thought there was none higher than them, and they had no one else to listen to. And the first was Pharaoh, who refused to release the Jews who had become slaves down in Egypt. And as it says in Exodus chapter 10, verse 3, so Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said to him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go so that they may worship me. That was arrogant Pharaoh. And it took 10 plagues to change his mind. And the last plague took the life of his firstborn son and the firstborn sons of all of Egypt and the firstborn of all the animals of Egypt. It took that before he would change his mind. And of course, he only humbled himself for a short period of time. The second man, the second is another arrogant ruler, and this one's name is King Nebuchadnezzar, who had conquered the Jews, and he had brought most of them back as captives to Babylon. And he is the one who finally learned that he himself needed to humble himself before God. And he finally did. Now, there are 3 proverbs that describe such arrogant men and how God could change some of them. Some of them. Nebuchadnezzar is an example of the arrogant man who God changed. Now, this change was an inner change. Inside, it changed his personality, his character. He changed from being prideful to being humble. But it was a long trip before he did. And it took 7 years. 7 years. Now, the Proverbs describe how he was before his downfall and what change was made for him to be able to rise up out of his misery. And here are those Proverbs. Proverbs 18:12. We go backwards. I don't know why they're listed backwards, but they are. They're backwards. There's 18:12 first, and that's not Tchaikovsky's overture. It's 18:12 is the number of the proverb. Now, it says this: before his downfall, a man's heart is proud, but humility comes before honor. The second proverb that describes another problem or a solution that comes along, Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And then in Proverbs 15:33, the cure-all. The fear of the Lord teaches a man wisdom, and humility comes before honor. This morning we want to look at Nebuchadnezzar's pride, his fall, and his recovery. And the first is his pride. And Proverbs 18:12 addressed that. Before his downfall, a man's heart is what? It is proud. But humility comes before honor, and that's the way it was going to be with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was a man with a proud and arrogant heart. And Daniel chapter 4 and verse 30 tells us about Nebuchadnezzar's pride. As he was walking out on the rooftop of his palace, looking out, and he saw what? He saw the beautiful city of Babylon. The city that he had built up. The city that was beautiful. The city with one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens. Don't ask me what they were, because the history book can't even tell me. But it just says they were the Hanging Gardens, and they were supposed to have been very beautiful. He walked around and he looked, and that's what he saw, and he said this: "Is not this great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" Oh, you don't say things like that. Here we have a man at the very height of his life, Nebuchadnezzar, who was not only a warrior king, but he was a great builder. He had built up that great city of Babylon until it was the greatest of all the cities of the world. And in it was, I said, one of those great 7 wonders of the ancient world. Now, Nebuchadnezzar had initiated a great building program and beautification program there in his capital city of Babylon. And when it was all finished, he forgot about a dream that he had had. A dream that he had had a year ago. A dream that forewarned him of his coming fall, which would come. Why? Because of his pride. His pride. We'll look at the warning in a minute, but first, Let's look at what he did wrong that caused his downfall. Have you ever completed a project or a task that took a little while, and you finally finished it, and you stood back and you looked at it, and you took a little pride in your work? You said, hey, I finally got it done. I finally did it. Boy, isn't this good? Well, that's about what Nebuchadnezzar did, but he did it a little bit on a grander scale, because he got carried away with himself. And he said, by my power. And he said, for my glory. As if there were none equal to him in the whole world. It's true. He was at the height of his career as king, but he was also at the height of arrogance, his arrogance. If Nebuchadnezzar lived in our day and our time, his attitude would be the norm. I mean, our heroes used to be humble people, but that's not so anymore. Our heroes are those who proclaim themselves to be the greatest. These are the ones that learn to develop an arrogant swagger. These are the ones who wrap themselves in an arrogant demeanor. They take pride in all of their accomplishments. And boy, I'll tell you what, I haven't heard a political speech lately that there wasn't oozing with pride. Candidates taking so much pride in themselves. These people today also take pride in their immoral behavior. And they even take pride in putting other people down while exalting themselves. That's the society we live in. They take pride in themselves. They think that, hey, no one can hold them accountable for their actions. And for the most part, that's true. They get away with it, especially if they're politically correct. Nebuchadnezzar's pride caused him to think that the world existed by his power and that everyone and everything existed for his glory. Didn't he say, is not this great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power for the glory of my majesty? But wow, wasn't he in for a surprise? As soon as he said those words, like Humpty Dumpty, he had a great fall. A really great fall. And all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. It's a great fall. Proverbs verse 16 and 18. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. And Nebuchadnezzar had a fall, a great fall, as Daniel records in chapter 4 and verse 31 through 33. The words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from the people and will live like the wild animals. You'll eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people, and he ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like feathers of an eagle, and his nails like the claws of a bird. Apparently, Nebuchadnezzar had completely forgotten his dream. The dream that he had a year ago. The dream about the great tree Tree so big and so great that all the birds came and stayed in it, that all of the animals and everything found refuge in it. Everyone found refuge in it. And it reached all the way up to the sky. And that great tree was none other than Nebuchadnezzar. But an angel of the Lord came down with a nice big axe and whacked it down and put chains over the roots, the stump. The tree was cut down. His pride took his kingdom away from him. His pride caused him to fall. That's a similar fall to the one that Lucifer, the angel of light, took when he fell from heaven because of his pride. However, in regards to Nebuchadnezzar, after 7 long years, he recovered. And his recovery was as fast as his fall. As fast as his fall. Proverbs 15:33. The fear of the Lord teaches a man wisdom, and humility comes before honor. There are no shortcuts to godly wisdom. It always leads through the valley of wisdom. And a man only gains wisdom after he learns the fear of the Lord. It took Nebuchadnezzar 7 years to make it through the valley. And as it says in verse 30, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. Now, this verse describes the crucial turning point in the life of one Nebuchadnezzar. For 7 years, he was a deposed king who wandered around in the wilderness as an insane man. Then it says, he raised his eyes toward heaven, and his sanity was restored, and so was his kingdom. And what that means is that in his misery, God finally got his attention. After 7 years, and he learned to fear the Lord. Then once that happened, he was restored. This situation is kind of reminiscent of Jonah, who after 3 days in the belly of the big fish was wasting away until he turned back to God. He learned to fear him and was finally ready to do God's will. Jonah records it in Jonah chapter 2 and verse 7. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. And guess what? When Jonah remembered the Lord, the fish spit him up on dry land. Not just spit him up anywhere, but on dry land. And when Nebuchadnezzar remembered the Lord, his sanity returned and his kingdom was restored to him. The results of this was that this pagan king acknowledged God. He acknowledged God as God. And in 437 he said, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all of his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Chapter 4 begins with a proclamation by the king that we didn't read earlier, back in verse 2. And it said this, it is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. This arrogant king learned humility before God. Which brings us to the lesson. And you know, there are several lessons that could be gleaned from this particular passage, this chapter in Daniel. But there's one primary lesson for us today. And the lesson's about pride. It's about pride. I don't care what they teach you in school. I don't care what they teach you out there on the football field. I don't care what they teach you in the basketball courts. I don't care what kind of garbage they're trying to feed you. Don't get carried away with pride. Even if you think you're the smartest kid in the school, don't get carried away with pride. Pride is an easy trap for any and all of us to get caught in. It's the trap of the devil. It caught him, and it catches others in that same trap. Even kings get caught in that trap. Great kings. And you know what? So did some of God's prophets and God's people. The only escape from the trap of pride is humility. There is no other escape. Humble thyself in the sight of the Lord. Humble yourself before God. Nothing else will cure it. You can do all of the things in the world that you choose to do, but until you learn to humble yourself before God, you'll never find an escape from pride. Now, the idea of humility is probably the most forgotten lesson taught at West Point, the Army's college and the training school for officers. At least in the early days, when a man graduated from the Point, he was expected to be an officer and a gentleman. An officer and a gentleman. We had the privilege of having Colonel Bill May here for a good while. And Bill May was an officer and a gentleman. The greatest of gentlemen. You know, he never forgot his training in decorum. But so many people do. And I know a few other people who learned about decorum at the hands of their own mama and daddy. And it shows. There are some among you who are very humble. And unfortunately, there are some among us that get a little proud sometimes. We need to learn the lesson of humility. Being a gentleman or a lady is not all there is to being humble, but it sure is a good start. And those that are not humble, what are they? They're the grumblers and the complainers. And they're the ones who demand their rights. And they're the in-your-face people. They're all the braggarts and all the arrogant people in the world. But remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 29. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Do you want rest for your soul? So the question comes, are you humble enough? Are you humble enough to believe in Jesus Christ and to believe Him and what He says? Are you humble enough to learn from Jesus? He alone can give you rest for your soul. He alone can give you forgiveness. Wouldn't you like to have that forgiveness of God? And wouldn't you like to really be able to feel better about yourself without being prideful? We can. But you have to trust in Jesus. We're going to have an invitation hymn this morning. Perhaps there's some here today who want to put their faith and trust in Jesus Christ, who want to accept Him as Lord and Savior of their lives, to be baptized into Christ, washing away their sin, rising up in a brand newness of life. If there is, we invite you to come forward as we stand and as we sing our invitation hymn this morning. Philip?
493, Psalm 22. We'll sing verses 1 and 3. Let's all stand, please, and sing. Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling for you and for me. Patient and loving, He's waiting and watching for you and for me. Come home, you who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, oh sinner, come home.
Doug has come forward. Doug Eggers to confess his faith in Jesus Christ and be baptized into Christ. We're going to sing one more verse. If there's anyone else that needs to make a decision, now's the time to do it.
Oh, for the wonderful love He has promised for you and for me. Though we have sinned, He has mercy and pardon for you and for me. Come home, you who are weary, come home. Earnestly, tenderly, Jesus is calling, oh sinner, come home. Be seated.